Now, Andrew, I've heard a lot of talk about this incident with Alfred Weber at the just recently, bringing up your information at a 9/11 conference, something about a being chased with Barack Obama by some kind of dinosaur on Mars. I don't know what the full story is or what Alfred was talking about. I haven't had a chance to go into it. So if you'd actually be able to elaborate and actually tell that story here to the audience, maybe they'll give them some background as well.
The air deserves to be cleared on that most important topic of 9/11. When I was a child in Project Pegasus, my father and I were called on an emergency basis to the laboratory maintained by the Aerojet Corporation on the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology campus at the corner of Bullock Avenue and Leroy Place in Socorro. This was in 1971. And it was in that laboratory in which photo analysts working for Project Pegasus were photoanalyzing not chronovision images, in other words, not holographic images of the future, but information that had been physically ferried back to the present on microfilm, containing essentially a 70-year history of the future. Basically, there was microfilm summaries of future events from the perspective of the early 70s, reaching to the year in which they were retrieved from the future and brought back, and that year was 2045. In fact, I participated in several of those probes to retrieve those canisters of microfilm from a Stargate device that was huge. It was a huge gate that was set up on the Olympic-sized basketball court at a WPA-constructed community center that's still standing in Cerrillos, New Mexico. If any of your guests visit Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they're driving around to the smaller communities, it's really immediately southeast of Santa Fe, these buildings. So we had been jumping forward in time, retrieving those canisters, jumping back from a teleport that was in the building there, and then popping back into view around the microwave tower at the Lobo Overlook Point, due west, 3 miles west of the Continental Divide sign on Highway 160 in southwest Colorado. And from there, we would surrender the microfilm canisters and then be bussed back to New Mexico. Now, when my father and I were called down to the location where that film was being analyzed, we were greeted in the hallway after my dad presented his Department of Defense credentials, and we were cleared by the guard with a gun sitting at the counter there at this C-shaped building there in Socorro, New Mexico. And it was an Aerojet Corporation facility. It had an Aerojet sign literally on the front grass. And in fact, I interviewed people working at the research library at New Mexico Tech who remembered that building and confirmed for me that it was there in the early 70s. And we were greeted in the hallway by a technician who said to my father in a very excited tone of voice, Ray, we've got it. We've got pictures of the event. We've got pictures of the domestic Pearl Harbor. So we were taken into a room there with about 20 different television monitors. And this individual took a Betamax-styled videotape upon which had been deposited some of the microfilm images 10 years before Betamax tapes entered the commercial market, certainly. And what we witnessed was about a 20-second film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers on September 11th of 2001, 30 years in the future. Now, I also remember times when the 9/11 event, as domestic Pearl Harbor-like event, within the continental United States, literally an attack on U.S. soil that such as had not been seen since the War of 1812, when, of course, the British troops burned down the White House. So this is a very significant event among the future events that they were gathering information about, because it was an attack, at least a terrorist attack, if not a military attack on the U.S. homeland. And there were times when my father, as one of the highly placed engineers in the project, who was reading the reports, the internal reports in which they were summarizing what they knew of future conditions and events, he was sometimes asked what he knew about this event that people were talking about in the program called 9/11. And he was describing the conventional view of the event. So, in furtherance of my duty to uphold the U.S. Constitution and my oath of truthfulness as a leader of the truth movement, and as somebody who simply was a material witness to prior knowledge by the U.S. government of the events of 9/11, indeed in a context in which the man who was defense secretary on 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, was serving as defense attaché to the very project I was on that had retrieved this data from the future, proof or evidence of a 9/11 linked terrorist attack, or at least plane attack on the Twin Towers. I wrote a very factual, very concise, single-space, 10-page affidavit that I submitted to the Vancouver 9/11 Tribunal. The result was that three principal figures in the 9/11 movement, namely Professor James Fetzer, researcher Kevin Barrett, and Barbara Honegger, used the unusual nature of my claims in that affidavit to begin basically attacking me as a witness and commenting about my testimony, which violates the canons of being a witness. You're not supposed to talk about you're not even supposed to know about other testimony. But they became aware of what I was claiming in my affidavit, began attacking me, began attacking the judge, which also violates the canons of legal ethics. And without even knowing that my story is true, and the fact that Donald Rumsfeld was the defense attaché on a project that had moving pictures of the 9/11 attacks 30 years before they happened, they made this peremptory judgment that I must be a liar or some kind of intelligence agent trying to disrupt the 9/11 truth movement, when in fact I was a critical witness to it. And they most of them withdrew from the Vancouver 9/11 Tribunal. Several of them, Fetzer and Barrett, went on to write these poison pen articles about me that totally distort my work, that distort my true experiences as a child participant in Project Pegasus, and as one of the chrononauts in the Jump Room program 10 years later, who has had the courage not only to participate in these projects in which new, dangerous and experimental technology is being developed, but who had then political courage to step forward to my country and what the U.S. government has done with their tax dollars, namely achieve time travel, and then 10 years later use it to get to Mars. But along the way, as a child who sat in many project meetings, many strategy sessions, and also lunches and dinners and cocktail parties with people like some Manhattan Project scientists like Agnew and Teller and Segre, some of the federal science administrators like Dr. Agnew again, or Stephen J. Lukasik when he was director of DARPA, or Ivan Browning when he was director of science and technology for CIA, individuals like Mr. Rumsfeld, who was the defense attaché to the project. I mean, I was witness to history. I was witness to advanced professionals in the defense technical community developing time travel and using it to find things out about the future. Well, along the way, they uncovered visual evidence of the 9/11 attacks. Now, Alfred, as a judge, believes that that helps establish the mens rea, the legally culpable mental state, for Secretary Rumsfeld's duplicity in the 9/11 events. I don't believe that's the case. What the evidence shows is prior knowledge, and in an era of quantum access, where previously prior knowledge created a rebuttable presumption that one was either a conspirator or an accomplice after the fact, that one had aided and abetted if one knew about a future criminal act. After the advent of quantum access, that's no longer true. All knowledge may mean is simply knowledge. One can be a government bureaucrat or technician and have evidence of a future event and have no mens rea to commit the event, not even to know about it in the conventional way. So what happened was I wrote a completely truthful affidavit about what Project Pegasus knew about this future domestic Pearl Harbor event called 9/11. I was diligent, spent a week of my own time, taking time out from my law practice. I'm a lawyer in solo private practice. I support myself. I have for 16 years without a single complaint being filed by one of my clients, much less any kind of ethical allegation against me. And I took a week out to write a hard-boiled 10-page analysis. Right, what happened was that quantum access enabled the U.S. Defense Department to get moving images and even to send individuals, including myself, I participated in some of those probes myself, from the future. Okay, so they were in possession of an awareness that there was going to be an attack in downtown Manhattan. Bernie just described some of the vagaries of when you're time traveling. Are you visiting that actual time and place, or some semblance of it that exists in a slightly altered condition in a different state of existence? But the bottom line is that whether we were visiting downtown Manhattan on the actual 9/11 or a variant of the 9/11 events occurring elsewhere in time-space, that as an intelligence finding, the U.S. defense technical community passed along to the U.S. executive, embodied in the president and other cabinet officials, the military, and the intelligence community, prior knowledge of 9/11. Now, this is germane to the 9/11 controversy because, at a minimum, it is probative of the notion that the government let it happen on purpose, the so-called lie hop position, or alternatively, committed it on purpose. Basically, that it was an inside job, as Jim Marrs has described it. I'm not taking a position because the information that I learned as a child in Project Pegasus didn't reveal who the perpetrators were. When my father described the event to his fellow engineers, he followed the conventional storyline, saying that it was Middle Eastern terrorists hijacked 2 commercial airliners and flew them into the Twin Towers that are just going up in New York City. This was in the early 70s when, the Twin Towers were finished in 1971 and 73, respectively. So they were literally talking about these huge buildings that were such marvels of engineering at the time, at least as public works, as tall skyscrapers. And the engineers in the project were listening to my father describe how they were going to be knocked down. In fact, my dad said, commercial airliners are flown into the buildings and they come tumbling down like a ton of bricks. And then one of the engineers asked him, well, what happens then, Ray? And he said, well, the country picks itself up, dusts itself off, and goes on like nothing happened. So he didn't really have a real keen sense that 9/11 would be a major and ongoing political controversy, nor that wars in Afghanistan and Iraq would be perpetrated based on the 9/11 event, that the Patriot Act and the NDAA would be passed in the wake of 9/11, and so forth. He just knew about the event in the conventional parlance, as you might find out about it if 50 years from now Wikipedia never changed its conventional take on 9/11 and stuck to the original storyline that we were all fed back at shortly after the event was perpetrated. But the critical thing is that a Defense Department intelligence project that Donald Rumsfeld was the defense attaché for. He was the point man. Project engineers like my father, physicists like, let's say, an Edward Teller, and federal science administrators like a Dr. Harold Agnew was reporting to. I was present at a meet and greet, at a kind of a lecture that Don Rumsfeld gave to the child teleportees on the project when he described how we had to keep the technology secret and how the principal purpose of teleportation was military. It would allow the U.S. Army to put troops precisely where they were needed on the battlefield. So in this Cold War project context, very, very sensitive information was learned, in this instance about 9/11. So when I brought it forward and really taking pains to write a long affidavit that would explain my background in the project, what Project Pegasus was, I described the different forms of time travel it researched and developed, and I gave the entire background for them to understand the 9/11 incident in Project Pegasus. These leading lights of the 9/11 truth movement so mishandled my information and so engaged in unethical conduct that Fetzer ended up accusing me of being an accomplice after the fact to the 9/11 event. Barrett wrote this farcical article for Veterans Today in which he mocked my claims about the jump room program. And here on your show, I'm bringing one of my co-participants, Bernard Mendez, who was literally Richard Nixon's go-to guy regarding the extraterrestrial situation. So here I've marshaled my co-participants in these several defense technical projects I was involved in as a child and as a young man. I've been truthful all the way along. I shared information that the entire 9/11 truth movement should be concerned about, and that is Rumsfeld's prior knowledge. That's always been an issue. And yet they pilloried me with condign misinformation and disinformation to obscure this most important data point. Now, I'm not going to criticize another witness because that's the unethical conduct that they've investigated in. I took an oath of attorney in 1996 not to subvert, among other things, to prosecute the cause of justice, which involves, and upholding the U.S. Constitution, I might add, which involves when you are a witness in an official judicial proceeding, not commenting on the evidence out of court and not commenting on other witnesses and their testimony. So I won't discuss their testimony or their take on mine. All I can say is I upheld my duty as a member of the bar, I upheld my duty as a citizen, and I upheld my duty as a human being to tell the world that this DARPA project had prior images of one of the planes striking one of the Twin Towers. And they want to conceal that now, and that's not appropriate. The truth has been told, and I will take my position all the way to the ICC if I have to, because it is the truth.
Okay, well, I mean,
I'm only angry because they basically attacked me as a witness, and I hadn't even been cross-examined yet. That's not legitimate.
You sound particularly upset, and
I am.
I have the same thing. Man. The thing that irritates me the most is when people accuse me of something that I haven't done.
Yeah.
That's the thing that incenses me and inflames me the most. I get real angry real quickly because I want to say the truth and I want to get it out there, but it's like the how can you do this? You know, it doesn't make any sense, and because it doesn't make any sense, it's crazy. So it drives you nuts. You know what I'm saying?
I did the principled thing relative to my time travel revelations. And I didn't insert myself into the 9/11 truth movement. I could have. I could have described this connection years ago, but I didn't because I knew if I did, just like we saw in this incident, I was pulled down the rabbit hole of ridiculousness about the causes of the 9/11 event by them. So I didn't want to. I was already investigating my experiences in Project Pegasus for a year and a half or so when 9/11 occurred. And so I knew as the debate over 9/11 fomented, as the books were written, as the conferences were held, if I articulated publicly what's in that 10-page affidavit, my entire truth campaign about the advent of time travel would have been subsumed under the umbrella of speculation and now ridicule and defamation regarding 9/11. But was I under a duty to ultimately, historically reveal this information? Of course. Rumsfeld was defense secretary on 9/11. He had been the defense attaché to Pegasus. We knew him personally. I was at multiple social engagements in bars, in hotel drawing rooms, at dinner, at lunch with Donald Henry Rumsfeld. In fact, I called him Rummy one time, and he said, "No, Andy, call me Don. I don't want you calling me Rummy." Of course, because he didn't want one of the kids in the project to be making a reference, to alcohol potentially, at least in terms of its inference. So I'm saying that. How could I go to my grave not making the 9/11 connection when Rumsfeld was both the defense secretary in 9/11 and literally the point man on behalf of the Pentagon to this secret defense project? It's clearly germane to the investigation. And to ridicule me after I wasn't even cross-examined as a witness, I haven't even appeared before the ICC yet, is highly unethical because there was a capability for Alfred and his co-judge Connie Vogel to cross-examine me, but that wasn't even permitted before Fetzer and Barrett were publishing these hit pieces in the internet news realm. That's totally unethical. They didn't even send me any questions saying, "Hey, what's the deal here? Do you expect us to believe this?" And I would have agreed to be cross-examined by them as fellow witnesses, but they never have. They never questioned me. They didn't send me a single email before writing farcical pieces to discredit a fellow witness who brought forward what will probably be considered critical information, establishing prior knowledge on the part of the U.S. government.
Can I ask you, Andrew, let's say you're not you, and somebody who, like you, comes forth with this kind of information, and you're cross-examining them, what would be the questions you would ask, and how would you answer them?
I would say, I would just go into every last claim. My approach to sharing my information about Pegasus has been inundated. So if as PhDs, Fetzer and Barrett know anything about evidence, they would have taken my claims one by one and done close questioning. But that didn't even occur. I mean, they could have been deputized as I don't know, as prosecutors, or given some kind of capacity, even on a pro tem basis, to question me because this information is so controversial and incendiary. I would have said, I would have gone into my claims. I would have asked about alternate explanations. I would have been asked the $64,000 question, which is, why did you wait 10 years or more to come forward with this data? I would have really grilled myself. But the thing is, I was ready, willing, and able to be grilled by Judge Weber, by Judge Fogel, or by any of my fellow witnesses, or even before the International Criminal Court. And I still am available to the ICC to be questioned. I simply gave this testimony because it was the truth. I don't even know to a dispositive certainty who perpetrated 9/11. I mean, there are some people who believe it was the U.S. administration. Other people believe it was the Israelis. Other people believe it was the Saudi regime. Other people believe it was extremists, terrorists. I don't know. I wasn't advancing a theory of who perpetrated 9/11. I was simply providing evidence based on firsthand experience that proves that a cabinet official in the Bush administration, namely Donald H. Rumsfeld, at a minimum had prior knowledge of the event, because he had to have, because he was more highly placed in Pegasus than my dad was. And one time we walked into a bar in Albuquerque, and my dad and Rumsfeld talked about the fact that Rumsfeld had been identified as a future defense secretary. And Don said, I saw that, Ray, in one of the reports, but let me tell you, that's one future event. I'll only believe when it happens. That means that Don Rumsfeld was reading the intelligence reports about future events that Project Pegasus was passing along to CIA. That means he would have read about this huge event in U.S. history where the two tallest buildings in the world were knocked down in downtown Manhattan, and 3,000 people died just in that event, and wars were prosecuted against two foreign countries. Okay, so my data shows that Rumsfeld knew on 9/11 of 2001, Rumsfeld knew the event was coming. That explains why, for example, he changed his desk to the other side of the Pentagon, because he apparently had prior knowledge that the Pentagon was going to be struck on the side of the Pentagon where his desk had previously been, etc. So I'm not saying I know who did it. It may have been another faction altogether. It may have been a reinsurance scam by an organized criminal network. I don't know. And in the event, I wasn't giving the answer of who I thought did it. I was saying my father described it in conventional terms as being Middle Eastern terrorists hijacking commercial airliners to achieve a political end by committing this mass act of terrorism against the United States of America. But I don't know who committed the event. All I was providing was information showing that on 9/11, a critical figure in the Bush administration, somebody standing, six heartbeats away from the presidency itself, Donald Rumsfeld, was, in fact, had knowledge, what the law would go. I think when Alfred refers to mens rea, he means knowledge, because mens rea, or the legally culpable mental state, under the common law, encompasses both intent and knowledge. I don't think it means, he said, I don't think he's interpreting the data to say that Rumsfeld intended the acts. I think he simply meant that he has what the common law used to call scienter. That is, a legally cognizable knowledge that such an event was going to occur in the future, or indeed on that 9/11. But my information is true, and I don't ultimately regret the testimony, because ultimately people don't matter. As Jacques Cousteau, Captain Cousteau said, individuals don't really matter. What matters is principles, purposes, and projects. And my purpose was to tell the truth so people knew that the U.S. government had prior images of the 9/11 attacks, and that a principal cabinet official serving on that day had what the common law called scienter regarding the event.
Is there any final things you'd like to wrap up, gentlemen? I mean, Andrew, what about you? I mean, do you feel that you've said enough about any particular issue that needs more expanding on, or final message to listeners? Or
I think I'd like to say that I spoke at length today about the controversy regarding my 9/11 affidavit. But I have to say that establishing one position or the other regarding 9/11 is not the thrust of my truth campaign, and I won't allow it to become that. I've been speaking out because the U.S. government achieved a time-space exploration capability over 40 years ago. And for the last 40 years, or 42 years since 1970 or so, we could have been relying on Tesla-based vortal teleportation to move around between major world cities. So think of the implications of that. Think of the implications of the fact that when Vice President Al Gore of the United States was sitting in his first greenhouse effect lectures with Dr. Roger Revelle as a Harvard undergraduate in 1970, the U.S. defense technical community had already developed a revolutionary form of transportation that, if applied globally, could obviate about 60% of the human contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. When we look at things like solar activity, volcanoes, etc. So the United States has sat on a revolutionary transportation technology that could literally clear up our skies and prevent the runaway greenhouse gas effect, the runaway climate change that might result in a new ice age for which the U.S. government and now other world governments are secretly spraying the chemtrails and poisoning all of us with oxides of aluminum and barium, and now we think maybe even strontium. So I'm not speaking out to have an effect on the 9/11 debate. It really is a minor dimension of my truth campaign. I've been speaking out because I want to advantage humanity by persuading the United States government to declassify and deploy in a global program of technology transfer its secret teleportation technology. And in fact, that's why I've decided to seek the presidency of the United States in 2016, because I think what we found, certainly in my country, I don't know if it's true of other countries, but we're simply not electing to high office the individuals who can have a catalytic change in society and galvanize the people to pursue the kind of revolutionary change we're going to need to save our civilization. It's the kind of leadership that President Kennedy evinced when he challenged the United States in 1961 to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade of the 1960s. We're going to have to set similar goals. And so I'm in this for the duration. I'm going to be running for president in 2016, calling for U.S. leadership in developing a new energy paradigm with the very vortal teleportation that we pioneered in Project Pegasus as the centerpiece of my platform, of essentially revealing it, constructing a program of technology transfer, to work a public-private partnership, to implement it, and to share it with other countries. So I just wanted to make that clear that I think we are in an emergency, and it's not necessarily who or who did not perpetrate 9/11. That's a very important ethical and moral and legal and political issue. But I think a more important issue, and in fact, one of the project engineers on Project Pegasus, Dr. Robert Beckwith, shared this opinion. Human adoption of teleportation, what he called levitated teleportation, by which he meant the Tesla teleportation that opens up vortal tunnels in time-space through which the teleportee passes. Back to New Mexico. Now, when my father and I were called down to the location where that film was being analyzed, we were greeted in the hallway after my dad presented his Department of Defense credentials, and we were cleared by the guard with a gun sitting at the counter there at this C-shaped building there in Socorro, New Mexico. And it was an Aerojet Corporation facility. It had an Aerojet sign literally on the front grass. And in fact, I interviewed people working at the research library at New Mexico Tech who remembered that building and confirmed for me that it was there in the early 70s. And we were greeted.
Now, Andrew, I've heard a lot of talk about this incident with Alfred Weber at the just recently, bringing up your information at a 9/11 conference, something about a being chased with Barack Obama by some kind of dinosaur on Mars. I don't know what the full story is or what Alfred was talking about. I haven't had a chance to go into it. So if you'd actually be able to elaborate and actually tell that story here to the audience, maybe they'll give them some background as well.
The air deserves to be cleared on that most important topic of 9/11. When I was a child in Project Pegasus, my father and I were called on an emergency basis to the laboratory maintained by the Aerojet Corporation on the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology campus at the corner of Bullock Avenue and Leroy Place in Socorro. This was in 1971. And it was in that laboratory in which photoanalysts working for Project Pegasus were photoanalyzing not chronovision images, in other words, not holographic images of the future, but information that had been physically ferried back to the present on microfilm, containing essentially a 70-year history of the future. Basically, there was microfilm summaries of future events from the perspective of the early 70s, reaching to the year in which they were retrieved from the future and brought back, and that year was 2045. In fact, I participated in several of those probes to retrieve those canisters of microfilm from a Stargate device that was huge. It was a huge gate that was set up on the Olympic-sized basketball court at a WPA-constructed community center that's still standing in Cerrillos, New Mexico. If any of your guests visit Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they're driving around to the smaller communities, it's really immediately southeast of Santa Fe, these buildings. So we had been jumping forward in time, retrieving those canisters, jumping back from a teleport that was in the building there, and then popping back into view around the microwave tower at the Lobo Overlook Point, due west, 3 miles west of the Continental Divide sign on Highway 160 in southwest Colorado. And from there, we would surrender the microfilm canisters and then be